Hello and welcome to the highlights from Chapter 1. I'm Mr. Rodman, going to take you through it on a constitutional democracy. Now, when we look at constitutional democracy, we think about the idea that it is a constitution, a ruling set of documents, or a constitution that essentially creates this government that we will then use these guidelines to follow. And democracy means that we have free and fair elections, popular sovereignty. We are able to vote for our elected officials. We vote for them. They represent us. They will then consent to the governed. They will then pass laws over us that we have to follow. And so this is the constitutional democracy we're referring to here. Notice the power is in the Constitution. So the power is going to be fragmented. You're going to have to gain consensus, build coalitions, negotiate in order to get things done, in order to get bills passed, in order to get laws signed into into action. You're going to need to work together to make that happen. And that is the point of a constitutional democracy. The founders and framers had that in mind when they created this government, this new government coming out of the Articles of Confederation, knowing what didn't work, knowing what was problematic in order to strengthen the power of the national government, but yet keep it in check so that the states had their rights, but also the rights of individuals to be able to have their freedoms as well. So, is it perfect? Not by any means, and we see we've amended it 27 times. It's certainly not perfect, but the idea is it is much more of a living, breathing document that we can use, and we can change as we go forward. Now, that leads us to a direct or a pure democracy. Now, in a perfect world, everybody would vote on everything, right? And everybody would get to weigh in, and that would be the pure democracy we're talking about here. And in a direct democracy, that would be how that would work. But when you have 330 some million people, that's a lot of people to try and get to vote on everything. So there are some ways in which we still see a pure democracy or a direct democracy at work. The direct primary is probably the best example. This is where members of a party can go in and vote for who are you going to vote for to be your nominee to represent your party in the general election in November. Remember, we have a primary, usually in the spring. We have a general election, which is always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, per Article 1 of the Constitution. And that then is how those primary candidates are selected through this direct primary. And that is elected by the people of that party. Now, in Maryland, we have a closed primary, so that means that you have to be a registered member of that party in order to be able to vote in that party's primary. But then you can, and you have that ability to do so. Virginia has an open primary. They do not have a closed primary, so you do not have to be a member of that party. You can decide you want a ballot for a Republican or a Democrat in order to vote in that party's primary, but you would vote for all of the candidates in that once you've selected it. So very different closed versus open primary there on a direct primary. Initiative is a petition. You may have seen them, the workers outside, the volunteers usually, outside of grocery stores asking, are you a registered voter? Would you sign our petition? Because in the state of Maryland, we need, I believe, 2% of the registered voters to sign the initiative or the petition in order to put it on the ballot. And what does that mean? That means it goes to referendum, that third item we see there. Vote yes on Prop 1. That means that it's gone through the initiative process. It is now on the ballot, and we are voting on it by referendum. Now, most of those referenda usually pass. Very rarely do they not. But that is the difference between an initiative, think clipboard, outside of a supermarket, and then referendum. It's an actual question on the ballot in November. So very different between the two there. And then we don't have this, but recall is something that many states do have, and that is if you get enough petitions, signatures on the initiative petition, you can actually hold a recall on an elected official or a judge. In California, the Gray Davis, I know many of you read about that in the Magleby text. Gray Davis was recalled. There were enough voters to put on the ballot to recall him, and then he was recalled. And Arnold Schwarzenegger from the Terminator, the Governator, was then elected to be the governor of the state of California. So that is one example of a recall that was successful. in that recall of the governor at the time. There was an electricity crisis. There was a lot going on, and that was kind of the backdrop of why the recall was successful. People were very upset about the price of electricity and power, and it wasn't being managed. The concerns were it wasn't being managed very well, and so that was the result. Okay, so that leads us to the representative democracy model, which we talked about direct democracy or pure democracy with those. Representative democracy involves three different models, and this is participatory, pluralist, and elite. Now, participatory is the easy one because that's we participate in politics. We vote. We sign petitions. We write letters to our elected officials and tell them that we are upset about issues. That's a participatory democracy. We are participating in that process, and we are making sure our voice is heard. Pluralist democracy, this is when groups are trying to negotiate for influence, to get the ears of the elected officials, and trying to really advocate for the issues that they care about in order to get them on legislation in order to get it passed. And so a lot of times it's interest groups, factions, you may remember from Fed 10, factions, what Madison was worried about. How do we prevent them from becoming too powerful? We use a pluralist democracy. We break up our society into national, state, and local levels, and also into different branches, the legislative, executive, judicial. And that is going to keep government in check, because no one can control all 514,389 elected positions in the United States all at the same time. And that's the point of a pluralist society or a pluralist democracy. And then the last one is the elite democracy. And this is where we have limited participation, and it's because we have the wealthy, the highly educated, the elite, those that have the ears of the elected officials. And I think the example I used in class was Elon Musk is a billionaire business owner and has done amazing things in business, and as a result, he had President Trump's ear, and President Trump said that he could do the same thing for the bureaucracy that he did for business, and so he came in with the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and thousands of bureaucrats in the executive branch in the departments and agencies lost their jobs to the tune of, I think the latest count was about 50,000 people lost their jobs as a result of that. That is very much elite democracy at work. That is a great example of the elite democracy. People who are decision makers and have the ability to get the ears of the or get the attention of the elected officials can have undue influence, and we definitely saw that play out there. We also see that with a lot of others. I mean, he's not the first, he won't be the last in that respect, and so jury is still out. Some people love him, some people don't love him. That is beside the fact, but it is a great example of elite democracy. Now moving on to the different types of government that are out there. We have an autocracy, which is basically one person controls the government and makes the decisions. Very easy to get things done, but not a lot of consensus. We have an oligarchy, which is a small group of people that have the decision-making power. A good example here would be the Chinese Communist Party, for instance, a small group of the CCP that have the ability to make decisions, but again, not a lot of consensus, not a lot of voting in elections and that sort of thing, like we would see in a democracy. Now, an absolute monarchy would be one in which the monarch has the queen, king, whatever, has absolute control, and so they can make decisions very easily, execute them, or they don't have to worry about gaining consensus. They don't have to run for re-election. That is an absolute monarch. And a constitutional monarch is what we see in Great Britain today. This is the idea that there are kings and queens, but they are figureheads. They don't really have any power because it really is the parliament, the legislative branch of their government that chooses the prime minister, who essentially acts like an executive. The legislative branch being the Parliament, House of Lords, House of Commons, that kind of thing. So they're really ceremonial. The kings and queens, the monarchs of that are very traditional throughout history, but they really don't have any power. They're there to open Parliament when it opens, usually in the fall, and other ceremonial rituals that they would carry on, but that would be about it. And then totalitarian dictatorship is the idea that we have someone who is making all the decisions, very, very autocratic or authoritarian, like we mentioned before. But this, again, not a lot of decision making or consensus building going on, and very easy to make decisions, but certainly not a democracy, a definitely different form of government than what we see in our representative democracy today. Okay, so what values do we see? We all agree that we love personal liberty, right? We love individualism, equality of opportunity, popular sovereignty, this idea of freedom, right? How we legislate that, though, is very different. And so we may agree that liberty is a core value. Individualism or equality of opportunity. You work hard, you make money, you earn it. Those are great values. How we legislate those items is really where we see a lot of differences. And that is the point that we'll talk about in subsequent units of this course. But for now, the idea of liberty, freedom, equality, all of these things are really good, feel-good type of values that we share as a society. But again, where that's going to break down and where we're going to get stuck is really in the details, right? The devil's in the details. And it certainly is true here in terms of how we legislate these items. What is true liberty? How do we make sure that liberty is continually supported by our government? And that is where we see a lot of legislative issues and differences in opinion, political opinion, differences in political parties, and that sort of thing. All right, so likewise, we all value free and fair elections, but what do those look like? What do those mean? Free expression, again, what does that look like? What does it mean? And we value the right to protest or the right to assemble. But again, what does that look like? Where does that break down? That's really where we see the devil in the details. And there's a lot of those details, as you can imagine, in terms of how we carry that out. And it's not just political parties here. It's even within political parties, how elected officials or influencers or interest groups are weighing in on some of the nuts and bolts of those interactions. And that's important here as well. Okay, so looking at some of the structures we have within this representative democracy of ours, we know federalism. It's that handshake. It's the sharing of power between national and state government. We also have separate powers that we talked about in Federalist 51. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay writing the Federalist Papers. And this separation of powers idea is really the idea that no governmental body has all of the power. It is separated. It is split up into three different branches: the legislative, the executive, and judicial, and they all have different roles and responsibilities, and we adhere to that in terms of those roles and responsibilities to keep any one branch from getting out of control. We'll see that with checks and balances, and we'll talk more about that in checks and balances in terms of what they can do to check the other branches. But the key here is that they are separate powers with different roles and responsibilities. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. The judicial branch interprets the laws. And those are their separate roles and responsibilities in terms of the powers that they hold. And if one branch tries to get out of line, the checks and balances will help bring them back into line. For instance, if the legislature passes a law and the president vetoes that law, they can override it. If the judicial branch finds that that law is unconstitutional, they can declare it null and void and basically say it's unconstitutional, and it will go no further. So these are great examples of where checks and balances step in to make sure that those separate powers, roles, and responsibilities are the the sole responsibility of that individual branch of government. Bicameralism is the idea that we have two chambers within the Congress, within the lawmaking body, like bicycle, and cameral, Latin for chamber. And the idea here is much like Parliament, where they had the upper house, the House of Lords, and the lower house, the House of Commons. We have an upper house called the Senate. We have a lower house called the House of Representatives, or the People's House. And these are two different chambers with very different functions. We will talk more about those in Chapter 11 when we get to Unit 2. But in terms of their differences and similarities, but the idea is two chambers, one a more of an upper house type of body, being the Senate, that is kind of going to cool things off, and then the heated passions of debate. The strong emotions of the electorate, of the people back home. We're going to see that more in the House of Representatives. We're going to see a lot more anger and the passions there, the emotions are going to be running much higher in the House than they would in the Senate, where we're going to try and cool things off, keep things deliberative, and try and build consensus along those lines. Checks and balances, we kind of talked about that briefly here, and we'll go into that in more detail, but the idea is we're trying to keep each branch from becoming more powerful than the others, and that really is the key here, to keep them in check so that no one branch has more power than the other. They are all separate and co-equal branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. And then the last piece, really enshrining the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments of the Constitution, in the Constitution, so that being able to ratify the Constitution, Madison made this agreement with the Anti-Federalists. We will propose a Bill of Rights that would be the first 12 amendments. 10 of them would be passed, and we will do that if you help us ratify this Constitution, because we don't want to open the floodgates to yet another constitutional convention. We want to pass this Constitution and move on for lots of reasons, as you can imagine. So that did tend to assuage the Anti-Federalists. They did agree with Madison in moving forward with ratification of the Constitution. They still had deep concerns about the role and the size of the central government, and worried about it becoming too powerful. But they went along with it so that they could get those Bill of Rights, those individual rights enshrined in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, keep in mind that natural rights theory is this idea that the rights and freedoms that we have, the liberties that we share, are not given to us by government. The idea of natural rights theory is that they're given to us by a higher power, and that higher power allows us to establish government, but the government can't take away that, because we can always change the government, because those rights are coming from something greater than just our government. And that is significant here, because Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Adams are all looking at this in terms of natural rights. Life, liberty, and property would become the pursuit of happiness. And we're doing this because we want to make sure that if we have to have government, which we do, to protect us from each other, and we're going to do it in a way that enshrines the unalienable rights that we have and share with those freedoms that we talked about before. Now, Hobbes, one of those philosophers, basically contributing to the viewpoints of Jefferson and Madison in writing the Constitution, Hobbes is saying we need government because we can't trust that humankind is going to be nice to each other. We've seen wars, we've seen lots of deaths of thousands of people, and we need government to protect us from ourselves. Now, John Locke says not only do we need a government to protect us from ourselves, but we need to form a social contract with that government. We need to make sure that if we are giving up some of our rights, our natural rights, in order to get this government, that we are protected not just by this government, but from this government, so that there is an agreement here between the government and the people, so that those natural rights are protected. And that's really important here, because Madison goes back to these unalienable rights that Locke talks about in terms of natural rights theory and the importance of this social contract to keep government in check. Now, Montesquieu says, how do we do that? How do we keep government in check? Well, we separate those branches. We create a legislative branch that makes the laws, an executive branch that enforces those laws, and a judicial branch that interprets those laws. And by having separate powers, and ultimately those checks and balances on those powers, we are going to keep government from becoming too powerful. So we are going to create a separate power for each of those branches that will then bubble up to the Constitution, the ultimate authority of our government that we have created. But the ultimate authority behind the Constitution is the people. And the people can decide, as Jacques Rousseau shared, the people can then decide that if government doesn't live up to the social contract we agreed to, then the people can break the social contract. And we saw this with the French Revolution. March the leaders to the guillotine. Now, we don't have to do that. We march to the ballot box and we vote to unelect our leaders and elect new leaders that will then, again, consent of the governed, pass laws over us that we then have to follow. And so we can break that social contract. And Rousseau was adamant that we can form a new government, or we can throw the elected officials out and elect new ones that will then carry out that social contract we've talked about. Now, Shays' Rebellion was really kind of the linchpin that did away with the Articles of Confederation. They knew there were problems, and this wasn't going to be good for the Articles of Confederation. They were really going to have to go in and make some huge amendments to provide a stronger national government, because there wasn't a government there to form an army or a navy or put down this rebellion. And so calling on state militias was really kind of the salvation of this rebellion, and they were able to put it down, but it really did showcase the concerns of the Articles of Confederation calling for this constitutional convention. And remember, the key here is that they went in to try and fix it. They really did go in and try and fix the Articles. They weren't looking to just throw the whole thing out initially, but what they found when they got in there was it was a hot mess, and there were a lot of things they were going to have to fix, including unanimity. Under the Articles of Confederation, you are going to have to get unanimous approval from all of the states, and not just 9 of 13, but 13 of 13. That is a heavy lift in terms of trying to fix. And then from there, the idea breaks down that it is significantly harder to do. So what they decided to do was throw it out, create a new constitution in order to address it. And it really centered on this idea of compromise, this idea of a separate branches of power, checks and balances on those branches, is going to force those branches of government and the political leaders, the elected leaders of the day, to really find negotiation, to find ways to work together, to form coalitions in order to get legislation through and pass good legislation for the American people. And we'll get into more of that when we get into lawmaking in Chapter 11. But it is important here that the role of compromise, because whether it's a large state or a small state, whether it's an electoral college that's selecting the president, if you will, if it's direct election of senators, or which would come along later, but senators that are basically selected by their state legislatures, there's going to have to be compromise somewhere along the way in order to bring about the best possible legislation for the American people. So notice that the Senate was not originally elected. Remember, I said it was state legislatures that selected the members of the Senate that would represent their states, 2 from each state. The president wasn't elected by the people. This was the Electoral College who decided on the electors. It was, again, the state legislatures. So you can see the role of states is really important here in terms of selecting these individuals that are going to go to the national government and represent their state, really focusing in and emphasizing the importance of the state representation in the national government. Judicial review. Notice that the justices on the Supreme Court are going to be chosen by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but they're not going to be elected by the people. And with good behavior, they're going to serve for life. And so that is significant in terms of differences along the way. It is going to be hard to pass legislation because it's got to be good. It's got to be good legislation that can really get through both chambers of Congress and be signed by the president. That is a heavy lift. So a lot of compromises here to try and limit the overall power of the national government, and that was by design. By design. So what do we have? We have the Virginia Plan that essentially creates a House of Representatives that is based on population. And the 3/5 compromise would basically say that slaves counted as 3/5 of a person, and all other men of voting age at that time that were eligible would also be counted. And the idea there was that based on that population, the Virginia plan would serve as the plan for the House of Representatives. The House would be run by population. The New Jersey plan said each state would have equal representation in an upper house called a Senate, and this would be 2 senators from every state, again selected by their state legislatures. And the Connecticut Compromise would call for this electoral college of election or selection of the President of the United States. It would also give judicial nominees lifetime tenure, meaning they could serve for life as long as they did it with good behavior. And the idea here was that there was no limit to that tenure. So a lot of compromises being made along the way in order to provide a constitution that is livable, breathable, and has power, but not too much that it violates the rights of the people. And that's really critical here because the Anti-Federalists were really concerned about the central government becoming too strong. They were really worried that basically this national government was going to take over, and they were going to have another King George all over again. And that was their main concern. So whether it was Melancton Smith, whether it was George Mason, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, they didn't want the national government to have too much power. And so that's why they really fought for this idea of a Bill of Rights, to enshrine the individual rights of citizens within this constitutional document, to protect them not just now, but also down the road, knowing that as this nation grew and this government grew, that this government wouldn't be so far removed from the people that it would become all powerful, and then they would be back in the same situation they had with Great Britain. So the Bill of Rights was the solution to that concern that they had, and as we said, the first 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights to address those issues by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the Federalist Papers. Pointing out, for instance, Federalist 51, the separation of powers, to keep government from becoming too powerful. Federalist 10, the role of factions and interest groups in trying to keep those interest groups in check, or those factions in check. Those powerful interests have to negotiate. They have to compromise. They have to work with others in order to get that legislation through. And then lastly, there's a number of other things in the Constitution that were there before the Bill of Rights was even added. Some really important ones, like writ of habeas corpus. I need to know what I'm being charged with if you're going to arrest me. Ultimately, I can't just be thrown in prison and not know what the charges are, not be brought up on those charges. Bill of attainder. Large groups of people can't be imprisoned for no reason. Ex post facto laws. You can't do it after the fact in terms of everybody wearing a blue shirt today is now going to be arrested. I didn't know that when I put the shirt on this morning. And so those types of things were things that the colonists were upset about, that the British government was doing to the colonists at the time. And this trial by jury, they didn't have one. Privileges and immunities, honoring those privileges from state to state, licenses and so on, and providing immunities between the states. All of this was in the Constitution and was important even before the individual rights of the Bill of Rights was added. Notice no religious test was also included in here. You don't have to be a member of a religion or any religion in order to be running for elective office in the United States of America. And then contracts were protected. Now remember, this was important. We were very commerce driven, very much a business-friendly type of government, and still are. And the whole point here was to protect those contracts. So through the honoring of privileges and immunities by states, these contracts are protected. And these are all found in the Constitution as well, even before those individual rights that break down the individual rights that people have over the government. And the key here is the Bill of Rights is focused on the individual freedoms and rights that citizens have over the national government. We're going to see later on with selective incorporation that's going to change, and it's also going to apply to states. But for now, it applied to the national government, not to states. And that was an important factor here. I hope you found this overview of the highlights of Chapter 1 very helpful. Good luck on the upcoming assessment. You got this. Live that 5.